Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at several organizations that are involved in a variety of issues such as reducing unemployment, promoting gender equity, and dealing with degradation around the planet, and lots of other issues that impact people, literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world. My guest today is an expert on many of these issues and on many of these organizations. My guest today is Mr. Patrick Sciarratta. Patrick Sciarratta is a special advisor to the mission of Sao Tome and Principe at the United Nations. Patrick, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me, Bill. Great to be back with you.
Well, it's been too long. It's been entirely too long. Patrick, you're involved, we'll get into Sao Tome and Principe, what you do as a special advisor, but you're also involved in a variety of other groups, and one is the Vinculum Foundation. That's one of the many hats that you wear. What is the Vinculum Foundation? First off, what is Vinculum? And then what does the foundation do?
It took me a while to choose the name because I wanted to find an opportunity to bring together civil society, where I was active prior to becoming someone working with a member state, and funders. You know, the idea of public-private partnerships, funding in general, often eludes civil society. And it makes them, if there are 3 legs in the UN, it makes them the weakest leg. So how did I come to vinculum? Well, vinculum is a Latin word, and not many people know. It is the line, essentially, in a fraction. Like 1/2, the numerator and the denominator are separated by that line, and that line is called a vinculum. And essentially, the vinculum is a link. And I wanted to be that link between funders and civil society, particularly here at UN headquarters.
And who are some of the folks who are, not all of them, but some of the people who are, or some of the organizations involved, and what are some of the issues they're looking at and some of the problems they're trying to address?
Well, you know, I wouldn't say that we're so much problem-oriented as situational. We're looking to support not merely an organization here or there, but I've begun to take on the idea that we might be of service to aggregate organizations like the Department of Public Information that has associative bodies numbering as many as 1,500 around the world. It would be great to have more and more of them be heard here at the United Nations. So if I can produce a large gathering on a particular issue, like we did with Ebola, especially through the mission of Sao Tome and Principe, or the NGO conferences, which occur all the time, either directly through the Department of Public Information, where I might be able to add service there by finding some partial funding for work that is going to be done anyway, or many, as you know, NGOs are now getting their own little conferences done in some of the smaller rooms, but still there are costs there. And so if I can assist in finding those who will underwrite some of those costs, we'll have a larger voice for civil society and a better interaction between civil society and the United Nations, youth and seniors, things like this.
Mm-hmm. So your organization would really be a catalyst, a convener, a coordinator, and you would provide technical assistance to a large degree to help bring these like-minded groups together to focus on reducing employment, combating climate change.
Well, what you're saying, you know me as someone who has produced many events here, so certainly offering the technical assistance is something I've done. I've been on every DPI NGO planning committee since 2002, for an example. But I'm talking about now going further and trying to find the actual funding that will enable the technical assistance to be paid, the speakers to be able to be flown in, all of the rooms able to be focused on in a way where we know that they're fully funded. And that would be a next step that I think since 2015 I've been very active in doing, and I think I've raised a considerable amount of money for NGOs here and for those purposes.
Now, you referenced a moment ago your involvement with Sao Tome and Principe, the mission here, and also some of the previous conferences that you put on, cultural events, activities like that. While we're into that area, mention 1 or 2 or 3 at the most before we get into the other major programs that you're involved with.
Once I left the NGO that I was working with from 1992 to 2015, I moved over to this area now, and I noticed that although my ambassador, Angelo Torriello at Sao Tome and Principe, was a cultural, intelligent, wonderful person who had loads of ideas, not many people know of the small micro state, the small island developing state called Sao Tome and Principe. So I felt like I had a dual role. We wanted to bring those cultural and other conferences to the fore, but I wanted to utilize them in order to promote Sao Tome and Principe's existence and create goodwill for it as well. So certainly toward the end of the Ebola crisis, we worked with the Secretary General's office, we worked with Ambassador Samantha Power at the U.S. mission and others to put together a very large conference, a large concert rather, in the GA Hall toward raising knowledge, awareness, and funding for the Ebola situation. Beyond that, our ambassador, Ambassador Torriello, created this idea, Humanacy, of how do we bring together the humanities and culture with diplomacy. And I think his thought was always the better we can unite these two ideas, then we can understand the other, because we're understanding their culture, who they are beyond their policies and politics. And I've always loved this idea. And so under the Humanacy rubric, we have done a number of other kinds of concerts and conferences. The International Day of Happiness last year was a concert that was broadcast around the world through UNTV, and we brought in such wonderful people, Western and Eastern artists who worked together and really created a wonderful basis for our International Day of Happiness. I mentioned the Ebola concert that we did, but then we did a number of conferences that really delved deeply into the idea of what is the value of understanding another's culture prior to you having diplomatic relations that become serious. How do we begin to understand each other before we start coming together on the policy level?
You mentioned the Humanacy Project as well as Ambassador Torriello. Our viewers can go to our website, www.globalconnectionstelevision.com, to see an interview we did with Ambassador Torriello about 2 years ago, something like that, right around there. But anyway, you've got so many others on the list here. The World Development Foundation. What exactly is that? What does it do?
Sure. Now, with the World Development Foundation is a perfect example of how Vinculum has been helpful in bringing together a funding organization with some of the projects that we hope to realize here at the United Nations. And the World Development Foundation was actually founded 2 years ago here in the United States, and it is a truly public-private partnership in that there is an individual, Dr. Zhenggang Guo, who has funded much of this himself, and he and his associate, Christina Isabella, and others at the World Development Foundation have brought together NGOs, funders, and other resources, primarily from Asia, who have underwritten a number of NGO conferences and similar events, youth programs, that look at the idea of, we have one coming up called the New Economy. How does the Bitcoin blockchain, how does the small island developing state interest in terms of development, how does development work in an area that is very difficult for development? In Haiti, we have interests, in Sierra Leone and elsewhere, and they have the ability to underwrite projects here, bring investors to the projects here, like conferences, symposia, and summits, and then bring them in country where they're needed most. So it's an educational process, and then it's an investor process in country. And in each of these areas, what we've always needed has been the funding to attract, to do, and then to bring. And WDF has been very, very helpful in each of those aspects.
And when we talk about NGOs, non-governmental organizations, people might think, well, I don't know what that is, and I'm not even involved in one, but in reality there are thousands of non-governmental organizations that are accredited, if you will, at the United Nations. They have liaisons at the UN. They work with the United Nations agencies on many programs. If you're a Rotarian, you're working on the Polio Plus program. 1.2 million Rotarians working with the UN World Health Organization, with the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, with the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. If you are involved in Kiwanis, you've been involved with the Iodine Deficiency Disorder program. So there
Lions
are Lions with a vision.
Exactly. Each one of these is an NGO. What we
That's
generally
right.
call them are nonprofits.
Exactly.
You know, and I think you were around too. In 1995 was one of my first major programs working with the United Nations with the Women's Conference in Beijing. And that was the first time I ever heard the words non-governmental organization. And before that, I think we all just said nonprofits. But this is a nice definition because it gives us the opportunity to discuss organizations that may not be per se nonprofit 501c3 legal entities. They may be ad hoc, but they're non-governmental. So I think that the term that, I don't know if it was CNN or the women who were at Beijing at the time began to coin was a clarification that may sound jargonese. That's probably why people like you and I go from non-governmental organization to just saying NGO
NGOs,
or
that's
nonprofits.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, we were talking about some of the service clubs we just mentioned a minute ago, but virtually every almost all, not everyone, faith-based groups, religious groups are involved at the United Nations. You have labor groups, you have environmental groups, you have business groups. So there's a broad cross-section of folks who are involved here at the United Nations and with the UN in with these programs. Well, let's move into some of the other issues that you've been involved with, and one is F.L.O.W. I'm going to make sure I get this right. First Ladies of the World.
Yes,
F.L.O.W.
you know,
what exactly is that?
When we started this concept, I think some people thought that we were just interested in working with, meeting with, and I'll discuss what we would be doing with, women who married presidents of countries. But no, we're talking about a much broader concept of women who are firsts in the world. We would, and I have spoken with first ladies in countries like Antigua and Sierra Leone and a wide variety of countries and first ladies. Sheikh Moza has seen our work in Qatar. But we're also interested in having Oprah interested. We're interested in all type of first ladies of the world. For what reason? We don't want to just come together and have a luncheon or a breakfast and chat. What we're hoping to do is what Ban Ki-moon spoke about at Davos when he said we needed a quantum leap forward for women's empowerment. And women's empowerment, their economic empowerment. And certainly UN Women have been doing a tremendous job in this area. And UN Women, as one of the great organizations of the United Nations, is looking at women at all levels, from the wealthiest to the most marginalized. Our interest is maybe to start with a summit. We are going to do a launch of the summit at the upcoming CSW, at the Commission on the Status of Women, coming up here at the United Nations. And the Commission on the Status of Women coming up in the spring is a perfect opportunity to launch the program publicly. I'm actually launching it publicly on your show right now, actually. But then in the fall, we hope, while first ladies are here, and many, many of the great women in the world are here in the fall each year, a great time to be in New York, would be a wonderful time to start a summit, a working group that would eventually grow into what might be the kind of equivalent of a women's Davos, because Davos is such a good old boys network, and to create an atmosphere where we can look at economic empowerment for women around the world. My own hope is to create the F.L.O.W. Bank. When the Grameen Bank was started, certainly it did microloans and microgrants to young women, and as it has morphed through its other relationships now with Goldman Sachs, etc., we hope to create the opportunity for a F.L.O.W. Bank to help women around the world who are entrepreneurs get their businesses off the ground and move them forward. It's an example of what F.L.O.W. could mean.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television network, or you just have a website and you like our programs, you want to share them, please go and feel free to download the programs. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost as a public service. Today we're looking at a wide range of organizations, commonly called non-governmental organizations, and what they're doing to reduce unemployment, to reduce poverty, to combat climate change, and to do a lot of other important things in the world to help create a better world. And my guest today is Mr. Patrick Sciarratta. Mr. Patrick Sciarratta is the special advisor to the permanent mission of Sao Tome and Principe at the United Nations. Patrick, we're talking about F.L.O.W, First Ladies of the World. What is the advantage? Well, there are many advantages to getting anybody involved in these issues because they do confront all of us, all 7.3 billion people, maybe not to the same degree, but certainly we have cross-cutting issues. But what do they bring? What special talents and special, I guess, credentials do they bring to the table to help focus attention on these problems? Because there are many of, in fact, all of them are accomplished in their own ways.
Well, as you've mentioned before, we're looking at several issues, and I like that you've said that a number of times because we're not focused on one issue like water rights or women's rights or any particular issue. What we think that what we have accomplished and continue to accomplish is creating a platform, which is where the UN, I think, has its strength. It has such a great pulpit to speak about many issues. So I mentioned earlier the new economy. How does the new economy affect women entrepreneurs in the developing world? We look at the issues from the perspective of F.L.O.W, from the perspective of the NGO conference, from the perspective of NGOs themselves, nonprofits themselves doing their own work here on cross-cutting issues like education. We just finished the very large Department of Public Information conference that was prepared here in New York in Gwangju, Korea, outside of Seoul. And there we had 4,000 participants. We looked at the Sustainable Development Goals, the new 15-year challenge from the United Nations to civil society, to the world. But we focused on education because we wanted to bring in young people. This next Department of Public Information NGO conference in August will focus on uniting youth voices with senior voices. The very young, talented, interesting, entrepreneurial young people with great ideas, but the seniors who have been here many years and bring experience and wisdom to bear together. With the First Ladies of the world, we've particularly looked at, my own interest has been in mezzanine funding. If the Grameen Bank started the idea of funding women, how do we now move them to the second level as their businesses grow? So there are several issues that you've mentioned.
Mezzanine being the floor between the first and second floors as you move upward?
Right. So now maybe they have their own little shop or their little farm or something small, and we would like to see the F.L.O.W Summit find institutional, regional, and wide-ranging ways for these new businesses to continue to grow and expand as they should. And that mezzanine funding, sometimes called in the investor world, is the most difficult. Well, we'll give you some money to start, but then when you need money because something went awry or you want to grow, and either way, it's hard to get that second level, and that's become a personal interest to me. Another interest of the small island developing states. I couldn't be an advisor at Sao Tome and Principe without that being important. However, I just did a conference that I produced with Ambassador Caleb Otto from Palau, and he said in particular that he didn't like the idea there were small island developing states. How about large ocean developing states? And so, how we even define them in the future.
Not SIDS, but loads or LODs.
Yes, I love it. So looking at all of these issues, really what we're trying to do is create a platform so that the megaphone that is the United Nations will work not only for the member states and not only for the staff and its interests, but for that third leg of the stool, which is civil society, so that we here at civil society, all of us are part of civil society, have that opportunity to be heard here as well.
Now, you've been involved in many United Nations programs. You've been working with non-governmental organizations, the private sector. You've been involved at the UN for many, many years, decades now, not just many years, but decades. As you look at the organization as it moves well into the 21st century, what do you see as perhaps one or two of the major challenges the UN will have? It's always funding. I know that's a problem, but what are one or two others that they will need to deal with, and to deal with aggressively as we move forward in order to help create this better world?
Gee, how much time do we have? Remember
We'll
when
come back and we've run out.
when Shashi Tharoor was
DPI.
Was with DPI here, he spoke on PBS TV often about the 10 stories that are not covered by the UN, and those are the ones that are most interesting to me. But one major challenge, especially as we move into another administration here in the US, and as the world roils through its changes, is the misunderstanding sometimes that the United Nations doesn't deliver to everyone what everyone wants. And why did we create this organization if it's not delivering? Well, this organization, the United Nations, is so precious to me because it is the family of man and woman. And how many families are not dysfunctional? Maybe there's a little dysfunction here, but we reflect that humanity. I have a close friend, it's like a brother to me, a young man, Ahmed Al-Handawi, the SG's youth envoy. And he once said to me that, you know what, if you want a good delivery agency, go to McDonald's. That's not what this is about. We're here to discuss, and we're not here to bully. If two parties come together and don't want to make peace, it's not our place to make peace. Having the world understand that we're a safe house, we're a place where if you come from one country or another that's at war, you can speak here freely, and we will nurture that, we will permit that, we will engage everyone in that discussion. That, if we were not here, would not happen anywhere else. And that is the true value of the UN. Its opportunity to open its doors to a dialogue that could lead to peace. And if it does not, we will then know why not. But look at all the many things that we do in some 150, 160 of the 193 countries every day to bring, to actually deliver, to bring food, to bring shelter, to bring peace to people. But I would still contend that's not our first mission. Our first mission is to keep these doors open so people can understand that this is a safe place.
And of course, when you talk about delivery, the UN does deliver. And
yes.
we really have to separate. You know it very well. I guess you have the political arm of the United Nations, you have the Security Council, the General Assembly, you have the peacekeeping. 16 UN peacekeeping missions, which are really somewhat the face of the United Nations
around the world.
And even with some of the problems that the peacekeeping missions have, they're still bringing peace and stability to many very war-torn areas of the world. You look at the other 80% of the United Nations that impact people, everybody in the United States and people all around the world, like helping to move ships, mail, weather information, to move aircraft safely in international airspace, to combat terrorism. These are all parts of the United Nations that we never hear about because they're functioning fairly well, they're functioning smoothly.
Because they're working well.
That's right. If there were a problem, we would be hearing more about them. But people, we really need to learn more about the UN. The UN is not a perfect organization. It has its warts and imperfections, but it's still, it can be argued, a lot of foreign policy people will argue that the UN has prevented World War III simply by bringing these warring parties together and having them talk to one another. As in the last 30 seconds we have, I don't want to dominate that, but what do you think the new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who is coming in as the 9th Secretary General, what do you think his major challenge will be in 30 seconds?
I was just thinking about this as you were saying that. And that Secretary General Guterres certainly has the opportunity to look further at refugee crisis, where he has a great deal of expertise. But what you actually delineated are his greatest challenges, and I think they're summed up into the Sustainable Development Goals, how we continue to do what we're doing on the policy level, the delivery level, and then bringing that together with civil society under the rubric of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think if we can do even partial, work there that's successful, the world will be a better place for it.
And most of the, if not all of the in fact, all of the organizations we talked about and didn't talk about with the non-governmental organizations are involved in supporting at least 1, 2, 3, or 4, if not all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to promote gender equity, to do things that are important to people in the United States and all around the world. And so we would just encourage our viewers to go and Google Sustainable Development Goals or go to www.un.org. But Patrick Sciarratta, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thanks again, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.